first, I would like to welcome Dr. Andrea Tilche to the stage. Dr. Andrea Tilche is the head of the unit Climate Action and Earth Observation in the European Commission's DG Research and Innovation. And his talk will be on science policy considerations on climate change impacts research on health and migration. So this will be connecting the last session with this session.
So I have the role of making a little bit of a transition between the previous session and then this one. Where we are, and probably yesterday you have heard many presentations on that, so I will be very short, but we are already at a level maybe on the bifurcation around the part between where the 2.6 and the 8.5 RCP bifurcate, and which correspond to areas that in the reasons of concern of Working Group 2 of the IPCC becomes to be colored. And in particular, I see that there is this distribution of impacts that becomes to be colored around this area, which is something that has an important value because it has to do with the impact on vulnerable populations. Well, your big colleague Stefan Ramstorff, with Anders Leverman, has integrated in the same figure some of the key, and of course, extending the range of temperature back in the past climate, recent past climate. It has integrated and it puts this in context of the Paris range, so this area between the 1.5 and 2 degrees, and which are possible tipping points that can be switched at that level, but also looking at higher end scenarios that are still possible, looking at the other tipping points that might be switched. So it's evident that some of these may affect both human health and human migrations. On one side, the release, for instance, from ancient ice of disappeared pathogens may go along with sea level rise, provoking displacement of coastal or lowland population. But we are already there, in particular where the impacts of climate change are evident and already affect human societies, and in particular the more vulnerable societies and the more vulnerable within societies in particular. So, talking of returning on the point of human health, and many things have been said by the colleagues before, there are, of course, direct and indirect impacts and many causes that may be linked to increase of impacts on human health. Maybe yesterday you have heard from some of the presentations that is now being investigated, even the increase of CO2 concentration as a possible threat, direct threat to human health. But there are indirect ones, because of course everything that changes conditions may change conditions for vector-borne diseases, may change conditions for many other things. However, for sure, what is important to say is that the mitigation will reduce health risks, both the direct and indirect, and it will reduce risks also compared to today, because we have to think in particular to the phasing out fossil fuels. What can be the advantage for improving air quality, and how much this links to not only respiratory diseases, but to other illnesses in general, like cancer and so on. So this may be the larger co-benefit among all in mitigation, in going towards a decarbonized society. The direct effects, last year the US Global Change Research Program has published a review of the impacts of health, and it has connected the impacts on health with a number of drivers, and has shown that how already in the last decade how this can be accounted for in terms of casualties and costs. Again, showing this framework that comes from the same report. There are many interacting drivers, but simplifying, the human health is affected in two main ways: by changing the severity or frequency of health problems that are already affected by climate or weather factors, and second, by creating unprecedented or unanticipated health problems or health threats in places where they have not previously occurred. For this reason, in the work program for Horizon 2020 that we are launching now, and by the way, it was pre-published on the website a couple of days ago, so this is publicly available, we have introduced for 2018 a specific topic for a call on climate change impacts on Europe that refers to climate change impacts on health. And we want to see in Europe as well to arrive to having a report like the one that the US Global Change Research Program has produced, in particular to address poorly understood issues, to quantify the projected associated costs and the co-benefits of mitigation and early adaptation, and to develop research activities looking at emerging threats and research gaps. So this was my bridge with the part related to the health, and I come now to the aspects of climate change impacts on migration and population displacement. It's an area where the literature is growing. There are more and more evidence that some connection may exist and may have already existed. It's known that the study that was done about Syria and how the prolonged drought in Syria may have exacerbated to record levels by global warming and pushed social unrest across a line into an open uprising in 2011. Of course, climate change was possibly a co-driver of this within already very critical social situation. However, it's not the displacement and migration cannot be seen only as a negative aspect, because it's maybe also a positive adaptation response in front of problems. And however, this is not always looked at in the right perspective. Of course, we have to look ahead and to see that having a perspective of changes that may lead to growing impacts. There may be growing impacts, in particular of some major drivers like sea level rise, and as we have heard well in the previous session from Dr. Huber, for instance, in particularly local situations where warming may lead to even non-livable conditions. But among the major overall drivers for migration, there are some that may connect with climate, in particular the threats to personal security, so which is of course an indirect, because when climate change impacts on drivers that affect personal security, there is a case of loss of major sources of income, and there are cases of destruction of properties. Now, the three cases probably, and I would like to see, we will hear from our colleagues later on, they may have different effect. In particular, the destruction of properties is not always leading to a change in place. It may lead to displacement, but people tend to stay where they are, even if conditions may become harder and harder. However, this, the connection between drivers of climate nature and the security has been shown in this paper, in particular in 2013 and later on. And there is a clear sign that going out of the comfort zone of the climate comfort zone, it's always leading to situations of stress that may increase violence, create difficulties in social relations, and so on. And this has been shown as possible cause of civil war incidents in sub-Saharan Africa, to produce local violence situations, and or other the onset of other conflict situations. So all this to say that also in this case we have, and I will go after this, that we are very interested to look more into this issue. Still in Horizon 2020, in 2019, we will launch another call dedicated to human dynamics of climate change, where a specific part will be on climate change and human migration. And we want to there identify and describe which are climate parameters that may have affect the drivers of migration, develop the analytical methodologies that may make this connection more robust, and demonstrate how those relate to human migration patterns. But this to design possible adaptation solutions that may help alleviate the pressure at the source, and for providing guidelines for policy recommendations, making also use of local knowledge and information that will be driven by, is mainly driven by civil society organizations, citizen groups. So I stop here, and I thank you for your attention. Here in my last slide is the website where the provisional publication of the program is there. Of course, I have to say, disclaimer, is a pre-publication. The Commission will formally adopt in a couple of weeks from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up is Professor Ulrike Grote. She's the head of the Institute for Environmental Economics and World Trade, School of Economics and Management, Leibniz University of Hanover. And please come to the stage. She will talk about rural-urban migration and climate change, evidence from Southeast Asia.
Yes, thank you very much, Kira. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are going to move now to Southeast Asia, namely to Thailand and Vietnam. And I'm going to give you some insights from two case studies from these regions. And these are insights on the motivation and welfare effects of rural-urban migration. Well, Thailand and Vietnam, these are two countries which are also affected again and again by disasters, by natural shocks, and so they're quite prone to be used as case studies here. Now, let me start first of all by motivating my research. Well, we find that there's an exponential increase in domestic migration in both countries. But if we look at these countries, we compare these countries, we can see that the migration history differs to a large extent. In Thailand, we have already migration for a long time, so there's a long history of rural-urban migration, whereas in Vietnam, migration is something which is actually playing only a role since Doi Moi in the mid-80s, and but overall we find that the increase, especially in the last decade, is massive, and partly due to the industrial development in the cities and the huge inflow of FDI in these regions. Now, if we compare the two countries, we also find that that they are quite different with respect to economic performance. Thailand is a bit more developed as compared to Vietnam, and the role of agriculture is also more pronounced in Vietnam than in Thailand. Now, if we look into the literature, I'm not going to give you a full overview of what has been written on these countries on rural-urban migration, but we do find that there is a little bit of literature on determinants and also on the welfare effects of rural-urban migration, but the results are actually quite inconclusive. And we also find that actually the data which has been used for doing the research is not really appropriate. There are major data constraints in, especially if we look at Thailand, for example, we find that the official UN statistics suggest that only like 20% of the Thai population live in rural areas, in urban areas. And as we know, everybody of you has been to Bangkok, well, obviously quite a few more people live there. The reason is that the migrants are actually not, they didn't change their official civil registration status, and based on data like that, of course, it's difficult to conclude anything concrete. With Vietnam, we have the similar situation. We have largely the VHLSS, the Vietnam Livelihood the Vietnam Household Livelihood Survey is used for doing research on migration, but we also find that this survey largely underestimates the number of migrants, and part of the problem is again the registration system which exists there. You have to be in a certain place to be officially being registered as a permanent resident, and for a longer period, like 3 years, for example, in Hanoi, you are not able to receive this permanent resident permission, which also means that you don't have access to certain public services and infrastructure. So, against this background, we had our own sample, our own survey, and first of all I would like to introduce you to the kind of questions which we introduced there. Just didn't have to get something off. Yeah. So the first question which interested us was which factors motivate rural household members to move to urban areas? And I'm of course particularly looking at shock variables. I'm particularly interested in climate change related shocks and ask the question, well, do they motivate actually rural households to migrate? The second question I'm going to raise here in my short presentation is actually, are migrants in the new urban settings better off in terms of working conditions and quality of life? And the third one is related again to the rural households, to the rural migrant households. And we're asking the question, what's the effect of migration on rural household income growth? Okay, so for doing this, or for trying to answer this question, we have our own survey. It's a big, actually 2 surveys, and this is data which we were able to collect. It's related to a research group funded by the DFG, the German Research Foundation. We have used one big household data set with panel data of close to more than 2,000 households actually in each country. So altogether we have around 4,000 households in these 2 countries and over several years. In addition, and this is quite interesting, quite specific here, we were able to do a migrant tracking survey. So we knew from the rural household surveys which households actually had migrants, and we were able to collect data from these specific migrants in the cities. And I'm talking about here in Ho Chi Minh City, in the greater Ho Chi Minh City area, in Vietnam, and Bangkok area in Thailand. So, in addition, we had a long questionnaire, more than 80 pages, with different sections. They allowed us to calculate the income and also a consumption aggregate. We not only knew where the income originated from, we also know, for example, what are all the socioeconomic information. We have information on a section on finance, and of course we have a section on the exposure to shocks and how do people actually cope with these shocks. Okay. Now, with respect to the first question, which factors actually motivate rural household members to move to urban areas? I'm starting with the descriptive table here, which gives you sort of an idea of what the households indicate as the main reason for migration. And we see that around half of all households said, well, we are searching for jobs. We are looking for job opportunity. That was a major reason indicated. The second reason was education. So some migrants existed because they went to school or they want to study in the city. This is much more pronounced in Vietnam than in Thailand. But there are also reasons like we followed the family, there was lack of money or food or debt, or some other reasons. So this was the first sort of descriptive results on that. In addition, we did do probability regression. You can see here the results of the probability regression, again showing different factors. We were particularly interested in the shock variables, and we found that first of all, the propensity of migration increases with environmental, agricultural, economic shocks, but only in Vietnam. In Thailand, we found that the migration decision actually decreases with demographic shocks. So meaning if somebody is sick or somebody died or somebody had an accident, people are less likely to migrate out from the rural areas. By the way, I should mention if I'm talking about environmental and agricultural shock, I'm relating particularly to floods, but also droughts or storms, or it could be also landslide erosion, or something like a disease, crop disease, or some livestock disease, which is closely related to some environmental factors. We also found, and if I'm mentioning here about economic shocks, I'm particularly referring to, well, it could be that the business collapsed, or that the output price decreased, or the input price increased, or that somebody lost the job, and so on. Okay. Now, we controlled for many factors, and we found that, for example, education plays a large role. So the propensity to migrate increases with the education. We do find also that the propensity to migrate decreases with the dependency ratios, because they have to take care more of dependents, like children or elderly. Or they also decrease within welfare indicators, like, for example, if they have land, they are less likely to move to cities because their labor is needed in the rural areas. This is a continuation of the regression, just to show you also what we controlled for. We looked at the distance, and we also looked at the regions, of course, and we do find differences with respect to the provinces. So the propensity of migration actually increases for households only from selected provinces. And for example, in Vietnam, it was very pronounced. The households coming from Ha Tinh, which is an area which is where you don't have lots of employment opportunities, here the households were more likely to migrate. Okay, so on the second question, are migrants in the new urban setting, so in the cities, are they actually better off if you look at their labor conditions, working conditions, or the quality of life? To get some insights, we calculated something which is called the Employment Quality Index. And this index consists of different subjective and objective assessments. The subjective assessments, as you can see here, is, for example, migrants were asked whether their income is stable, whether they perceive that their income is stable. Or another question was working conditions. Have they improved since the last job? Or living conditions, have they improved since you've left the rural areas? And we actually do find that a high percentage of the migrants saying, yes, they have improved. So the percentage of those indicators is quite high, around 70% in Thailand and in Vietnam. If we look at the objective assessment, it's slightly lower. Now, objective assessment would be, for example, what's the share of migrants with accumulated savings? Were they able to save something? Or the share of migrants with above average income? Or the share of migrants with written employment contracts, for example. Here, the result was less pronounced. So obviously, the subjective assessment is much better than the objective assessment, which can be due to several reasons. Okay, now, with respect to the third question, now, if the household had migrant, the rural household, and did they actually benefit in the rural areas? So it depends, of course, a little bit on the remittances which are also sent. And here we calculated a difference in difference model with propensity score matching. I'm just going to show you the results here. And we do find in both countries, in both case studies, but particularly in Thailand, it's highly significant, the result, that the income of the rural household had increased by 17 to 22%. You can see on the right column. In Vietnam, also a slightly significant impact of 20 to 27% of increase of the income of the rural households, rural migrant households, I should say. So overall, we can say, yes, the rural household also benefited from having migrants. We also looked a little bit, well, is there a regional difference? Does it differ by province? And yes, we do find that there's a difference. In Thailand, for example, the rural households living in Ubon, Ratchathani, they particularly benefited from migrants, from having a migrant in the household. In Vietnam, it was more Ha Tinh province. Ha Tinh province, again, it's a region where we have relatively low employment opportunities. Okay, so let me summarize briefly. Well, we can say, based on these results, that migration is a livelihood support strategy for households experiences climate change related shocks, in Vietnam at least. In Vietnam, education is also a major reason for migration, and in Thailand, many household members migrate because they want to follow their family or due to debts. We do also find that the probability of migration decreases with the employment opportunities in the village, as we've, for example, seen in Ha Tinh in Vietnam. Another sort of interesting statement I would like to make here, that 50 to 60% of all migrants look for job opportunities in the cities, and that the migrants perceive themselves to be better off in the cities. And lastly, the rural migrant households directly benefit from migration through positive income growth effects, but again, it differs by province. Now, just briefly conclude, we could say that in rural areas, actually, it would help to promote the quality schooling and providing also more employment opportunities. In urban areas, well, the registration system don't seem to be always in favor of the migrants, so there's a call for improved social protection for the migrants. And let me just conclude that in the long run, any coping strategy will remain ineffective if there's no effort in combating the climate change itself. Now, in case you're more interested in the urban areas, please allow me to also refer you to another conference, which is an interdisciplinary conference, which we are organizing in Hanover very soon, and at the end of November, 27th to 29th of November. It's called Dangerous Landscapes, and it's particularly a very interdisciplinary platform for developing risk reduction strategies for low-income communities which are threatened by natural hazards. Yeah, and with that, I would like to close, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you. So next up is Susanne Melde. She's a senior analyst at the Global Migration Data Analysis Center at IOM, the International Organization for Migration. She will talk about climate change adaptation, the role of human mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira, and good morning, everyone. So I would like to present the results of a 3-year research project that we've been implementing with 6 international partners, among them Koko Warner in her previous capacity. She's the next speaker at the United Nations University's Institute for Environmental and Human Security. And so what we looked at were 6 countries around the world, which you see on the map. We looked at Haiti, Dominican Republic, Kenya, Mauritius, also Vietnam, and Papua New Guinea. And they were all selected based on facing different environmental challenges. So you have countries like Papua New Guinea, who's facing any hazard you can imagine: sea level rise, droughts, floods, tsunamis, volcano eruptions. We have small island developing states. And then we also have very populous countries like Kenya and Vietnam, who also have different migration patterns. So in Kenya, you have immigrants and emigrants, internally displaced persons. They're also hosting an important refugee population. You have countries like Vietnam that has not a lot of immigration, but a lot of internal migration, as we heard about. And then Papua New Guinea, which has hardly any internal migration, and also hardly any international migration due to the land tenure system there. So what we looked at was not whether the environment or climate change is a driver of migration, because as we've also heard early on, it's pretty well established that migration is a multi-causal event, so it's very difficult to say, someone moved just because of the environment. There are many other factors that come into play. So we took this a step further and we looked at the impact. So when people move, and people are moving, and they have been moving for a long time as well, what does that mean for adaptation to environmental and climate change? Does it have positive or negative implications? And we looked at 3 types of mobility, which are migration, displacement, and planned relocation. Those are based on the Cancun Adaptation Framework from 2010, and maybe Koko will tell us more about that later. So what we did is we did surveys in 5 of the countries. It was unfortunately not possible in Papua New Guinea for different reasons. And we compared migrant and non-migrant households, so to see, is this specific to the general population, or is it something that is really just affecting migrants? We looked at origin and destination areas, because in most of the research, you're either interviewing the migrants or the families that stay behind, but they may, have a bit of a rosy picture about the whole migration experience. So we tried to look at both areas. And the importance of this study is that it's one of the few that actually takes a comparative approach across countries. So most case studies that we know so far are either qualitative, or they look at 1 or 2 countries, but they're not necessarily comparable. And then we also did qualitative interviews. And we included about 7,000 households in the 5 countries, and about 2,500 were migrant households, about 35% on average. So what are some of the key findings? So in the survey, we asked those households that were affected by a disaster, so for instance by a flood, have you taken any measures to prepare for any of these events in the future? And among the answer options, we had 2 that relate to mobility. One was that they moved to a safer place, which you see in this kind of greenish color on the graph, and then sent a household member away to earn money, which you see in green on the graph. Maybe I can also use this. So what you can see is that in most countries, households are already engaging in migration because they said, okay, we've been hit by a flood or by, the areas hit by storms all the time, so they have been moving away. And you can also see that in particular in Vietnam, that people also use migration as an income diversification strategy, which we also heard from Professor Grote. And it's important to keep in mind that most governments assume that this migration is not yet taking place, that it's something that we talk about in the future, but it's already occurring, as also Dr. Tilche alluded to. We then also asked those households that were affected by disasters if they received any warnings before this happened. And what you can see in red is those households that didn't receive any warning. And you can see that in most of the countries except Kenya and Vietnam, about 80% of the population, be it migrant households or not, didn't receive any warning. Or what you can see in yellow, they received a warning, but it was too late to react. If you're told there's a flood coming and your house is flooded in 5 minutes, that doesn't help. So this has important implications, about the warning systems. They're not reaching the population, or they're reaching them too late. And it's interesting to see that in some cases, like in Kenya and Vietnam, they seem to be working a lot better. And for instance, in the Dominican Republic, we got the feedback that, there is an early warning system, this can't be true, but then this means the early warning system is not really reaching the people that are living in the most vulnerable areas. We also asked those households that have a migrant in the household, what the overall impact of this migration was on the household. And what you can see in this graph, in green we depicted when they said it was mostly positive, in yellow when it was negligible, and in red when it was negative. And you can see most of the households say in the 3 dimensions, employment, education and health, that the impact was either positive or negligible. And this again relates to the point that many governments assume that migration is something inherently negative, and that the impact and the effects are something negative, and it's to be avoided. But it can be an important strategy to access employment, as we also heard from the other case studies, but also education and health, because people may move to cities and there maybe the infrastructure is better for these social services. But there are also issues when we look at discrimination and exclusion. We asked households whether they faced any discrimination in the areas of employment, health and education. And you can see in blue are the households with migrants, and in orange the ones without migrants. And what you can see is that migrant households were more likely to face discrimination, and in countries like Mauritius and Vietnam, you can see they were almost twice as likely to face discrimination. So this may relate to them living in informal settlements, not having an address, or maybe they have to work in the informal sector because it's very difficult for them to access formal employment. And just the last point on remittances, so the money that migrants sent home to their families or to relatives or friends. We asked them what they use these remittances for, and you can see in brown that in most countries, especially in the Dominican Republic, they mostly spend it on food, but also what you can see in blue on education, on healthcare in orange, and housing, which is kind of light orange. So this relates to they're using it for basic necessities, but and this relates to critiques about migration and development, not this money being invested in productive uses. But it's important to keep in mind that if it's about food security, it's probably better that people can ensure their food security than not having this at all. So just to summarize. The key findings. So moving out of hazardous areas is already a strategy that many households have adopted in the countries we've looked at. What we saw is those that are affected by disasters are often not alerted, so there's really some action needed on making sure that early warning systems are developed or are effectively reaching vulnerable populations. We've seen that the impact of mobility on well-being is mostly positive or negligible, but there are challenges related to discrimination and insecurity. And then remittances are used for, fundamental basic necessities. And just to close, because we looked at different forms of mobility, just to highlight when we, for instance, look at comparing displacement with seasonal migration in the case of Haiti, and this was developed by the United Nations University Institute on Environmental and Human Security Studies, you can see that those people that were displaced here on the very right had a very high level of vulnerability, which you can imagine if you're displaced, you don't have access to adequate housing, food, social services anymore. But interestingly, those people that moved for at least 3 months every year, so seasonal migrants, which you can see here, were less vulnerable than others who moved in the short term or long term, or the overall population. So this is an important strategy that can help to adapt and to decrease vulnerability. And if we look at the different types I mentioned, so the seasonal migration in Haiti helped to decrease vulnerability. We also looked at cases of planned relocation, which means that an entire community needs to be relocated as a last resort because they may be affected by soil erosion or coastal erosion. And so it's helpful to move the community out of the harm's way. So for instance, in the Dominican Republic, we looked at the case of a community next to a lake, and the lake level was rising and threatening to flood the village. But then when they were moved, they were facing new vulnerabilities because they were further away from the main street where they used to sell their produce, or they didn't really have land plots allocated, and so it was difficult for them to keep their livestock. And as I mentioned, displacement is a huge challenge in terms of vulnerability. And I think I'll keep the policy implications for the discussion, and would like to thank you for your attention.
So our last presentation on this panel will be Dr. Koko Warner. She's the manager of the sub-program on climate impacts, vulnerability, and risks at the United Nations Secretariat, UNFCCC. And the title of her presentation is Resilience and Transition, Opportunities and Limits of Human Mobility as a Vehicle for Managing Climate Impacts and Risk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Kira, and hello, friends and colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be with you here at this important conference. What I'd like to do to add on to these great presentations is give you an idea of how you, as the climate impacts research community, have influenced policy in climate, how you're playing a bridging role between climate policy and other big policy areas like the management and governance of human mobility, and at the end give a little bit of an outlook of where your contributions might help us in the policy realm. So just as a context, 2015 was a great year for those of you contributing or working in United Nations policy arenas. We started out with the Sendai framework and a big commitment, or at least a big framework to reduce risks related to disasters. We had an ADIS commitment around redoing development finance. Of course, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, which really gives us an aspirational focus towards 2030 of how we want to develop and leave no vulnerable groups behind. And of course, the Paris Agreement for us in the climate policy world crowned that year. It was a tremendous aspirational year for the international community. Just a month later, at the beginning of 2016, the Syrian refugee situation it kind of crashed onto the news, at least in Germany and in many other countries in Europe. You had Brexit, which is an ongoing conversation, millions of people being displaced. You'll hear this kind of rough statistic from colleagues who are working on displacement. 4 times as many people annually are displaced by weather-related and other kind of natural catastrophes like earthquakes than by conflict. So it's an annual kind of concern. And then you have the US elections, the German elections, where human mobility features very prominently in political thought and political dialogue. So this is this great period of contrast that we have. Big international aspirations of sustainable development and the hard realities on the ground, which have this narrative of migration, refugees, and other kinds of human movement woven in. So right now, with the international community, the rules governing the 21st century are being set. You're very familiar with climate policy, and I'll make a comment about governance in the world of what our current framework is for governing migration as well as refugees. I'll kind of contrast and compare what that looks like. And for you as a research community, you're bringing evidence about the realities of human mobility, which we've heard about from Susanne, Ulrike, and you, Andrea. It's a little bit hard to read, but we'll start here. In New York, over the past couple of years, there's a very big conversation going on there called the Global Compacts on migration. And there's a longer name, but there are two global compacts, one on migration and one on refugees. These global compacts are really concerned with contemporary mobility issues. So if you could read this small print, it would show you that some of the issues around governing migration in the 21st century. Oh dear, I pressed too many buttons at once. Let me go back. So with migration, the contemporary issues have to do with complex forms of migration. Not only are people moving in search of jobs, but they may be motivated by safety, they may be motivated by all sorts of things. So we have these complex flows of people crossing borders, and our governance of migration needs to evolve into the 21st century. There are issues of regular or documented migration rather than people crossing borders without the proper paperwork. There are issues of matching people searching for jobs and people looking for people to fill jobs. There are issues of not migration, but remittances. So all of these things are things that affect migration thought today. On the issue of asylum, with, for example, the Syrian refugee situation, the international community sees very large scales of people can move in short periods of time. And some countries have been feeling perhaps left alone or unprepared to handle these large flows of people. So, and certainly the humanitarian system. So on the issue of asylum or refugee movements, the international community is trying to anticipate large scales of people on the move, what needs to be done to be prepared for that, what do areas of origin, transit, and destination need to do to coordinate so that people so they're not in an even more vulnerable situation. So these are contemporary issues. To contrast that, let's move now to the world that you work in climate impacts. One more thing. The challenge is today we need to evolve our policy into the 21st century. We have plenty of challenges. And what could be is that your work as the climate impacts community could help bring a time perspective, a spatial perspective, and ultimately a climate impacts perspective to shaping those rules. Right now, the rules are being shaped for current realities, but all of you are looking just a little bit into the future. And you see that some of the parameters that affect everything that the international community cares about are changing. And so we need to find ways to bring that perspective in. This is a visual that we use from time to time in the area that in my portfolio that we work in the UN climate negotiations. One of the areas that I supervise is loss and damage. So we have this little visual, and the icons represent a range of climate impacts. And then we've put them on a kind of geography so that people can start thinking about how these different impacts could interact with vulnerabilities in areas that they live. And this spurs many different kinds of conversations. And so you see that many of these different impacts could foreseeably affect people on the move, and they do so in different patterns. We'll take a look at those. This is a bit of a quick review of what's already been said, but a schematic that might help you think about these patterns of human mobility in the context of changing climatic situations. The first thing that you see, this house that's kind of tipped over, that picture is taken on the coast of Alaska. Permafrost is eroding in a more rapid way than was before, and people's actual safety is at risk, and so people are retreating and moving away. That's one pattern that we see. Pattern number 2 has to do with livelihoods. As seasonal patterns change, or as rainfall is more or less erratic, unexpected, people's livelihoods can be directly impacted, and Ulrike was telling us quite a bit about this. This third area, Andrea turned to quickly, and that is, this picture was taken on the border of Somalia and Ethiopia. It's a refugee camp. We happened to be doing field work there in the early part of the year of 2011. A big drought was developing at the time. And overnight, about 2,000 new people were coming into this camp in Schewe. And when we had a chance to talk with these people, and when they talked to us, of course they were coming from an area that was conflict-ridden, but their reason for coming had to do with drought. And so you'll get these complex interactions, as Andrea pointed out, between climate stressors and other stressors like conflict. And then finally, something that we don't know much about is an area as a question of habitability. This picture was taken from our field work in Kosra. It's an island of Micronesia. There's a question about longer-term habitability of some areas of the world. And what I've taken here is a picture of a family's garden, and the practice there is to have family graveyards in the compound where people live. And the reason that I took this picture, I didn't take the picture, a colleague did, was you see that habitability and the idea of moving invokes identity, cultural ties, a sense of belonging and community. And ultimately, those are the things that when we face risk and stressors, those are the things that often give communities whatever mysterious factor that they need to endure and continue. Those are factors of resilience that we need to understand more about. So on this slide, I'll say the same thing with just a little schematic. This is put on a time perspective, and we need to know more from you about the time perspective. But if you can imagine, the x-axis represents time, and probably in a decadal scale. So we might be looking at the next few decades with this. This first pattern has to do with the impact of rapid onset events. People need to move quickly in order to maintain their physical safety. Often people are able to return. So this is a displacement pattern that you already see worldwide today. The second pattern was, Ulrike was talking about this among others, when farmers that don't have irrigation face really erratic weather that affects their livelihoods, their ability to feed themselves and their families, their ability to earn an income. And they may go in search of work or in search of food. If they're successful, they may be able to send remittances back home, which can be a great help to families. And again, Susanne was pointing that out. If, however, they aren't able to attain work or food or whatever they need, both the families at home and the person who is left home can be in an increasingly vulnerable situation. So there's more that we need to know there. The third pattern are these complex interactions between areas affected by climate stressors and other kinds of stressors like conflict. We know from other literature that when it is okay to return again, that people do return, when peace returns, when conditions go back to a livable situation. But with climate stressors, this is an area that we don't know enough about. When will return be possible again, and under what circumstances? And this fourth pattern, again, has to do with habitability, and this is the one that we know least about. We don't understand the geographic scale or the temporal scale about habitability. One thing that did strike me as all of you were speaking, however, is globally there's a massive trend, not to be stopped, of urbanization. Just a couple of years ago, we passed a milestone when estimated half of the world's population live in urban areas. Another big statistic or figure that I've heard is about 70% of the world's mega urban areas or mega cities are in coastal areas. And we have a sense that climate stressors have a special kind of implication for coastal areas. And this again raises the question of both habitability, whether we need to adjust our value systems of what's habitable or not, and how we think about where we live and our identity. So a lot of questions. I'm over time just a little bit, but let me tell you what we're doing in the UNFCCC area to address human mobility. Unlike contemporary discussions, like the ones going on in New York about migration and refugee governance, in the climate policy area, we think about human mobility as a risk management issue. So we don't really talk much about areas of origin and transit and destination. We think about risk management. And one of the things, perhaps, that the Paris Agreement could contribute to contemporary discussions about governing human mobility is this notion of what would the world look like if we managed to stay between 1.5 and 2 degrees? And what would that mean for potential large-scale movements of people? And what would that mean for risk management and preparation? Would like to preempt risk and minimize it, plan for it, and we also may need some contingency arrangements. We ultimately need a very candid discussion about what we want, be it sustainable development or maybe even a little more precise, and what gets in the way. And we're trying to contribute to that through, for example, the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism. A lot of detail. The final thing. 4 opportunities for research and policy to work together. We need to move from a crisis orientation in our policy world to a resilience orientation. Those are kind of big words, but this echoes what I was just saying. We need a very, again, candid conversation about what our policy objectives entail and what gets in the way, and where there may be limits or thresholds. And a lot of your work can help influence that evidence base. We may need to think about livelihoods and equity at a systemic scale. We need your concepts, your measurements, and your observations about what's going on with livelihood shifts worldwide now. Climate stressors could, we anticipate, will create really large systemic impacts on livelihood systems, and that could affect large-scale movements of people. Andrea touched on this. We need new ideas about fragile states and perhaps some new inspiration, particularly from the social science, about how to think about fragility, conflict, as well as communities maybe just pulling apart. And then finally, we need new concepts of borders and translocality. Our international policy right now is focused on member states, at least in the United Nations. So our decision makers are national level decision makers. A lot of the action happens in cities or subnational levels. And some of the important trends, at least spatially with climate change, happen regionally. We hope that you as scientists in the climate impacts world can help us understand our world beyond the political borders that define our policy processes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the other panelists to the stage to join us for a discussion. And if we could have 2 more microphones up here, thank you. So we heard that under some circumstances, like in Thailand and Vietnam, migration can be a beneficial adaptation strategy. And in other cases, we see that it leads to an urban poverty trap sometimes. So what does efficient development policy look like? Is it a facilitation of migration? Is it migration prevention? How should it be formed today and in the future? That's my first question to the panel.
Sorry about the technical issues. I would say, as I've also tried to demonstrate in the presentation, migration can be one adaptation option. Of course, now we shouldn't say everyone needs to move, but it should be among the options that are considered, and moving away from the sedentary bias that many governments have, that it's something bad when people move. But it's also important, as we heard also from the presentations, to address vulnerability and to decrease risks. Just to give you an example, in 2013, the ODI Institute said that only 0.4% of all official development assistance was invested in disaster risk reduction. Now you've probably seen, what happened in the Caribbean with the hurricanes. We've, seen floods in Southeast Asia all the time. And this is, there's a lot of resilience that can be increased, and it doesn't need to, a disaster only becomes a disaster if the community is not ready and cannot handle the hazard. So there's a lot that can be done to avoid displacement and to address it beforehand.
Yeah. Okay. Well, taking my case studies, what I would say, well, in this case, facilitation would help, but certain facilitation, for example, in the urban areas that, as I referred to the household registration system, that would be some kind of adjustment of that system would help the migrants to live in the urban areas and to have a sort of a reasonable life there, because then they have only then they have access to schools and to other facilities. So in the case of Southeast Asia, we also found that there is some positive income effect for the rural households if they have migrants. So in this case, I would say yes, facilitation would help. But we have also done some studies, for example, in Tanzania. A similar survey we implemented there, and just got some results from that analysis, and it's clearly showing that the migration households were worse off with respect to food security. So their level of food insecurity was increasing if they had migrants, indicating the major reason was actually that the labor was missing in the rural areas, so they didn't have enough labor force in the rural areas to increase the productivity, which led again to food insecurity. And this is a case where I would clearly say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't facilitate, we should allow it in certain cases, of course, but I wouldn't sort of be sort of, yeah. So you have to, there's no one solution for, no, you really have to look at the cases.
Thanks, Kira. Just what does an efficient or maybe effective policy look like? Two things come to mind without trying to be prescriptive. Informed. Decision makers, countries need to be informed. They just need an idea of what's coming, and the time perspective and the spatial perspective that this community has is really helpful and needed. That means what factors matter for people who stay behind, for people who may be trying to move. Many helpers, many donors want to know if I had a certain amount of resources to invest, where can I invest with the result that people will be either not worse off or better off. And we need to know what factors matter. Drawing on the development research community over decades, they've found out with a lot of confidence that for development, if you invest in the education of girls, you'll get a really great bang for your buck. And we need something equivalent in the world of mobility and climate stressors. Similarly, just understanding the patterns. You see it's nuanced. It's specific to different climate stressors, different geographies, certainly different societies. And again, that's where you can absolutely contribute. For policy, regardless of whether people are moving, trying to move, staying, we need safe, dignified, regular, robust policy. These big mega trends are not to be stopped, but policy can make a difference in helping people attain their highest aspirations, which is just, at the end of the day, to have a good life, to make sure that they have food on the table, that their kids can go to school. And policy needs to facilitate that safety, dignity, regular movements if people do move. What that means, by the way, in the mobility lingo is that people are documented. When people move, they don't have to do so at risk of their personal safety or dignity, that they're not prey to human traffickers, or that there's a whole world. And then robust for you, with all that you know, means that the solutions won't just be robust now, but that they're robust in the future, taking climate impacts into account.
Well, I totally agree with Koko in particular, and I don't have much more to add, but to say that, of course, at the European Union, we have also long-term policies of development support that are now looking at supporting the process towards sustainable development and to achieving the sustainable development goals as a whole. And they all may lead to improving conditions that lead to avoid migration, to prevent the causes of migration. Of course, there are among, I like the framework that Koko presented that is similar to what I said orally, that the forced migration linked to climate issues may essentially be in relation to threat to personal security, to loss of sources of income, and to destruction of properties. In the last case, you have to intervene with management actions that are very short-term and sometimes are in relation to disaster management approaches. But it is also the case where most probably it's a shorter time for displacement and return, because usually this is, but we have to ask ourselves also in other situations. For instance, now, this year, we have seen what happened in Puerto Rico and in the islands, in the Caribbean, one after the other, one hurricane after the other. So a situation that if next year we have the same situation there, we are going towards a case where destruction becomes continuous and long lasting, and therefore we have to put then. So the kind of information that climate scientists have to provide is to give this kind of information to governments in order to see what is better to do, and even in situations like the Caribbean, what is better to plan for the future in some areas.
Yeah, just to dive a little bit deeper into exactly this issue, we're now understanding more and more how climate impacts, physical impacts such as floods and droughts, and human mobility interact. So where do you think the points of intervention are to ensure that migration is an option and not a measurement to save one's lives?
Yeah, just also relating to the points that were made last, I think it's important to look at the distinction between internal and international migration. So also migration in the context of environmental and climate change takes mostly place within countries, just as migration in general. And most of that migration is not managed, or whatever word you want to use, and it's occurring. There are only a few countries who restrict it, like Vietnam, through the registration system. And then when we look at international migration, there's some important good practices, for instance, humanitarian visas that the US, but also other countries in the Americas are using to provide protection to people who have to leave their country because of the earthquake or the hurricane, etc. There's also a lot of legislation at the national level in countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, who provide an entry category for people who are affected by environmental and climate change or disasters. So there are important initiatives at the national and, let's say, regional level, because in the Americas I think they're quite advanced in that, but then in other regions it's less so. And I think we also need to keep in mind, we were talking about borders. There's a lot of informal borders, in West Africa, in East Africa, there's a lot of mobility. So the question is, do you want to try to regulate that or not, or can you actually try to support it further, when we look at free movement regimes. And also it's important to keep in mind, when we also talk about development, more development leads to more migration, because you have more people have more resources who can actually afford migration. So it's also to keep in mind that, yes, it's important to look at root causes and human development, but it's important to keep in mind that it's not possible to stop migration.
Okay, well, a couple of comments on this, what can we do and what kind of intervention would be useful. Well, one thing I didn't really get into also in my presentation was that it would be useful to upgrade the low-income communities in many cities. So upgrading of slums, for example, of poor areas and cities. And we already heard yesterday also that early warning systems and evacuation plans, they can make a huge difference for people living in these communities. I think this is something definitely worth following. Another thing, well, a lot of job situation seems to play a big role. So trying to find a job is not always easy. Very often migrants end up somewhere in the informal sector in more hazardous jobs, and to avoid that, sort of some support with respect to job search, I think would be a huge help. And a bit related to that is also the implementation of the labor laws. That is something that the state could also intervene and make sure that labor laws and social standards are properly implemented. And I think this would already help quite a bit.
I don't have any specific issue, but you mentioned two things. You mentioned drought and floods. Now, they are two completely different things, I guess, because typically floods are phenomena which create a moment of disruption. And droughts, in persistent droughts, create much more prolonged damage, and they may truly be cause of displacement of farmer population or people who live on land. However, and I guess that it's important that in research we definitely differentiate between phenomena and effects. But the other point is that migration is expensive, and those who migrate are frequently not the least well-off, are already capable of migrate, so they have some capabilities. It's a sort of having a capability of mitigating a problem that happens to them, to adapt to a new circumstance. The problem is for the less well-off that do not have those capability and may really stay in situations that become unlivable. So we have to look at those first.
Perhaps surprising partnerships would be a point of departure. For you who are targeting your work towards academic journals, if it were possible, could you disseminate your work in other journals and reach beyond? I mean, I know that you're probably doing your disciplinary journals as well as climate-related environmental journals. Could you bring your insights to other journals that reach out to other thought areas? Could you bring your work to bear to other processes? We can't get enough of you in the climate process. You have such a legitimate and important role through your work, through the IPCC, but perhaps there are other policy processes, land use, clearly mobility, Social Security Administration, planning, where your work could help expand paradigms and unlock ideas about what to do. Third, engage with different ministries. I don't know how much your work engages with ministries at all. For sure, the UN policy processes are all about ministries, and in the climate process, we typically engage with environmental ministries and ministries of foreign affairs. Could you help reach finance ministries, planning ministries, ministries of interior, ministries of agriculture and water? Reaching out to those colleagues could help bridge the silos and help bring this wider perspective. People moving is a story as well as an actual phenomena that needs to be managed. And if you could help expand the narrative to why it matters to take climate impacts into account, that would be super helpful. And then the fourth area could be in cities. David Bresch was talking to us during a break, talking about cities as really a place where a lot of the transformation and adaptation is and will be happening. Cities would be a key place. They're areas of destination for a lot of people on the move, and areas of opportunity, as well as they have all of their own challenges. Those are four areas where your work could be brought to bear even more than it is now.
So we're allowed to cut in a little bit into the lunch break, and I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We'll take about 10-15 minutes from now on to answer questions. And please introduce yourself very briefly. Just say who you are.
Okay, my name is Betty and I come from Kenya. I work on the field of climate change in arid regions. So I actually work with pastoral communities. So my question is to Susanne. It's actually a clarity question. What were the triggers of migrations and which communities did you actually target? Because you showed a graph that showed that the migrants were discriminated. So it's just a clarity that where were they discriminated and who were these people you actually talked to?
So thank you for your question. Just to make sure that I understood correctly, you were asking which communities in Kenya we were targeting. So we looked at 3 different communities. We looked at Nairobi, the capital obviously, Kisumu and Kitui. So we were looking at some origin areas and Nairobi as the destination area. Is that what you were asking?
Sorry. Within Nairobi, how did you do your samples and how did the climate impact come in? I'm sorry for interjecting.
Okay, so how we selected, yes, sorry. So we developed criteria for how the survey sites were selected, and they were based on, how prevalent are environmental changes, so how affected are they, and this was especially for the origin areas, so it wasn't as much for Nairobi. So that they were facing droughts and floods in Kitui and Kisumu. We were looking at, is there migration into the areas or out of the areas or both, so that we can see, are there any migrants moving, mostly internal migration in all the cases we looked at. We also looked at some operational things like, is it secure to go there? Is it possible to interview people? What was the time of the year to do the survey to make sure, that it's not in the rainy season and they can't access the villages. But I'd be happy to discuss more in detail what exactly we base it on.
In the back, there was one. Okay, please start here.
I can
Yeah,
start.
go ahead.
My name is Andrea from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, but I'm an economist, not a meteorologist. I have a question about urbanization, and more particularly the structure of urbanization. So we do know on balance that urbanization brings net benefits, even though some categories of migrants may be not so well off. But overall, as you also showed in some of the presentations, it is positive, and we know also from literature it is. However, mega cities are not necessarily so beneficial. And in fact, what is happening in a lot of developing countries, that the migration is centering on one or two cities that are getting mega cities. And there is some evidence in regional science and regional economics literature that kind of mega cities, which are dominating the whole national economy, they may even get a sort of predatory kind of nature. And there was indeed also this reference to the resilience in the rural areas. So a more balanced urbanization, but also some medium-sized cities in the countries get a chance to develop in a sensible way, and thereby, for example, maintaining better relations with the surrounding rural areas may be a much better way to have an overall more positive urbanization and migration effect, and also keeping the rural areas more resilient. What are your views on how that could be achieved compared to the current trends?
Okay, who would like to take this question? Would you, on migration on mega cities being less effective than maybe to medium-sized urban centers? Is this the core of it? Yes. It's a bit hard. You have to really speak up because we're sitting underneath the air condition, so it's a bit hard to understand some of the comments. No, just... Yeah, like mega cities versus... Yeah. Would you like to comment?
What I can comment only is that there is some economic literature on the fact that more people in cities correspond to growth in GDP, usually. But I would like to see if there is some literature that connects this to some limits or thresholds or boundaries over which you have then problems. And of course, but we are now in a situation where, due to globalization, the effect of decrease of local agriculture capacity of feeding the city is sometimes not felt because there is a massive amount of products that can be imported or transported from other sites. So this is not easy, but may at the end create more social problems because of the disrupting of societies than truly economic ones.
The question in the back there, please.
So thanks a lot for your presentations. My name is Kit Vaughan. I was previously director of the humanitarian organisation CARE climate programme.
Can we turn the mic up a little bit because it's really hard to understand?
Yeah, it keeps going on and off. Okay, so my name is Kit Vaughan. I'm an independent consultant. I'm really interested in this whole conference why we're not talking about the C word, the compensation word. Why are we not having a discussion about liability and compensation in the context of migration? And what needs to happen to have that frank discussion? Are we all too comfortable? Or is it something that we don't feel comfortable talking about? But for many of these communities, they're being impacted by the effects and policies of other nation states. And it's very clear that we all have a liability, but other people are feeling our impact. So I'll be very keen to hear about what the options are for compensation discussions going forward. Thank you.
Okay, compensation. Who would like to take this difficult question? Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. My big boss isn't here yet, and so I will address what you asked. Kit. Patricia Espinoza will join you later this afternoon. For those who follow discussions on loss and damage in the climate discussion, this narrative of we understand the drivers of anthropic climate change, we know where those drivers are located, and we also are beginning to understand some of the huge costs of anthropogenic climate change. So shouldn't the causes of the problem help fix the problem? And that's this really old narrative, old meaning like 2 decades, that some groups of countries have been, asking this legitimate question. As you know, in the Paris Agreement, paragraph 52, I don't know if you guys are that policy wonky, but there's this paragraph in the Paris Agreement that says all of these discussions exclude liability. We're not going there, full stop. And part of it has to do with the structure of UN policy fora. Nation states are the main drivers of the discussion. Nation states also house some of the drivers of climate change. And the countries involved in that discussion said, why should we get into this? This is going to be a big headache. We don't want to go there. So that's what the story was in the Paris Agreement. There are probably lots of nuances, but just really kind of overview. It doesn't get us away from the question of what do we do about the impacts, particularly because there are huge social impacts as well as dollars and cents impacts, and so we may be using different vocabulary. Compensation and liability are poisonous words for us, and they feel kind of scary and are absolute mood killers. But what can we do? And maybe a question back to you, Kit, or others, what can we do to really help countries and regions, because some of these are transboundary issues like mobility. What can we do to be very candid about the things we need to be prepared for?
So we had, I'm going to take 2 more questions, and one was the lady over here, and then the lady over there. Yes, and we're going to do the questions one after another, and then each one of you can make a final statement on both or on one of the questions. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Linh, and I'm from Vietnam. So for like a year, I worked for Care International in Vietnam, and I work a lot with the migrant women.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, can you hear it now? Okay, thank you. So
Super.
I just start again. So I'm from Vietnam, and I work with Care International in Vietnam for a year. So my work related a lot with the women who migrate to the city. And I think there's one missing aspect in, let's say, in that research is about gender. And gender is really make a big difference into different group of the population when it's come to climate change and it's come to the migration. So I don't know whether in that research you also include the gender aspect and see it from that aspect when it comes to the result. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question?
Thank you. I'm Abigail Gardiner from Jamaica, and well, as the Caribbean's been experiencing these Category 5 storms, and we've been seeing the devastation. One of the big challenges is precisely the whole issue of compensation, and essentially if we are going to do the necessary to adapt or relocate, who's going to pay for it? Because the other dimension is that the region is largely under-resourced, and insurance is a luxury. So the reality is that the most vulnerable people, even the middle class, are not able to pick up the pieces and move on. So that's my first issue, and then the second issue is where are we going to go? So you take a twin island nation like Barbuda, Antigua and Barbuda. So the Barbudans have been moved to Antigua, but if a hurricane hits Antigua, then where are they going to go? These islands at most, 500, maybe 700 feet above sea level, and this is a reality across the region. So given where the whole international policy dimension is now, we are looking at the possibility of relocating, but relocating where?
Okay, thank you very much. Also another very important question. So we had the first question on gender, and then on relocation, where to go and who will pay for it. Would you like to start?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Lynn, for your question on gender. Of course, we disaggregated the data by sex, and we have several findings specific to gender. Just to mention two, because you mentioned Vietnam. There we did a case study of relocation, and in one of the places we visited, they relocated a village further inland, so away from the coast and the Mekong River Delta. And the men were still engaging in fishing, and they were, doing well. But what this relocation project kind of forgot, that women didn't really have any income opportunities. So they were just sitting there and, had nothing to do. So it was kind of a partial relocation because they forgot, half of that population. And in Haiti, we found that households that were headed by women were a lot more vulnerable than those that were headed by men. So there were also very specific gender findings that I didn't get to in the shortness of time, but we integrated that very much.
Okay, well, I would just like to confirm that actually what you're just saying. I think gender is a very important aspect, and as a matter of fact, there is little research. I have a PhD student now working on gender a little bit in Vietnam, so, but I don't have any results. But we do find, if you look into the literature, we do find that women or households led by women, that they are less likely to have migrants because the dependents are more likely to stay behind to support the women. So that's like one of the results which we get. But as I said, much more should be done, and it's a very important question, yes.
So, not addressing either of your really pertinent comments. Maybe just a final word from me, and then I'll be quiet. We notice around the world that at every scale, communities, provincial levels, and on up, that there are some activities in preempting and avoiding risk or minimizing it. There's a lot going on in planning. A lot of times they're separate. And there's a little bit in terms of contingency arrangements for these stresses that make life hard for people and make life difficult for countries. But these piecemeal approaches, and I don't mean to sound critical, but these siloed approaches, when you add them up, our approach now is associated with far greater costs than if we could do what we're really poor at right now and take a holistic view that looks at building resilience in ways that interlock preemptive and planning and contingency arrangements. If we could find a way to help our decision makers make wiser decisions under uncertainty, that's like the holy grail of what you're doing and what we're aspiring to, it could avoid unnecessary costs and minimize some of the costs that we're getting locked into right now. So although I'm not addressing both of your really valid perspectives, if we could find a way together to really have a resilience perspective, meaning getting serious about the aspirations that we have and speaking specifically about what factors matter to reduce poverty, to take gender into account, to make sure that people can live safely and well, and also have a really candid conversation about what gets in the way, and preempt and plan and put contingency arrangements into place would do better when it comes to costs and impacts on society.
Dr. Tilche, a last final statement?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the gender issue, we are definitely very interested to have this as a part of our research activities. And we propose to address this point wherever is relevant, and definitely in the two cases that which I talked about, health and migration, it's both cases very relevant issue, and I look forward to receiving proposals that contain this dimension. As far as the compensation discourse, I guess that here it's a complicated, very complex story on which I don't know how much science may help, truly, because it is, well, there is a process ongoing. The Warsaw agenda is on loss and damage is ongoing. However, I guess that in the Paris Agreement, what is the very pragmatic approach of the Paris Agreement is, let's look at the issues, the fundamental issues on which we don't see now to open other Pandora's box of discussion, and let's try to press the accelerator on mitigating climate change in order to prevent damages. This is the key issue. Let's invest massively worldwide in this process. Let's give, well, whatever effort we can do, and also through the other agendas that are the Lima, Paris agenda on, so from cities, all the bottom-up actions that can help both to mitigate and to adapt to the already committed climate change. This is the way to go now. Of course, there are, and taking into account as much as possible with the international donors and with the climate finance to the needs of less developed countries in order to help this agenda more than to fix the past damage, to help this agenda in order to build the future, a sustainable future. This is the accent on which we have to work, I guess.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to close this very interesting panel. I'm extremely grateful for all of you to come. Thank you.